Welcome everybody to today's National HoUSed campaign call. We will give it about a minute or so for people to have time to log in to today's call, and then we'll be right back to you. All right, thanks for joining us. Okay, we will go ahead and get started with today's call. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Paul Keeley, the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Again, I want to welcome you to today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, and affordable housing. We have a great call today. We'll be joined by Senator Chris Van Hollen, a Democrat from Maryland, who was instrumental in getting the additional rental assistance investments in the Build Back Better Act. We look forward to chatting with him. During today's call, NLIHC's Sarah Sadian will share some details on those and other Build Back Better housing investments and what actions advocates should be taking now to ensure Congress passes the bill. Our good friend Megan Sandell from Children's Health Watch will join us to discuss the intersection of housing and healthcare. We'll also hear from two of NLIHC's End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions state partners about efforts they are undertaking on emergency rental assistance funds tracking and on grassroots outreach to prevent evictions. We'll also get an update on emergency rental assistance spending, as well as other federal, state, and local actions needed to protect renters. We'll get updates from the field and much more. So again, a great call today. We'll jump right into it. I do want to just urge everyone, if you have questions for any of the speakers or panelists, please enter them into the Q&A box. You also may use the chat for chatting with one another, but really for the questions, I will focus mostly on the Q&A box. So I'll look for questions there. We will do our best to respond to questions. Sometimes we don't have time to answer them all, but our speakers can often stay on to answer them in writing. And we often are able to follow up and incorporate your questions in the documents we create, like frequently asked questions and other guidance and so forth. So we appreciate it. So please feel free to use the Q&A box for your questions. All right, I'm going to turn now to the NLIHC Vice President for Public Policy, Sarah Sadian, who's going to talk about the historic housing investments in the Build Back Better Act and what's next. So Sarah, take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Good to be with you. A lot of big news last week, so I want to go over what is the latest in the Build Back Better Act, and then I'll shift to talk a little bit more about where things stand with enacting it. So late last week, President Biden and congressional leaders unveiled a revised Build Back Better Act. This new version, or this pared down version, I should say, costs about $1.75 trillion, or about half of the $3.5 trillion that was originally proposed. We're really happy to see some more details about what was included, and that includes $150 billion in housing investments, including really significant investments in the HoUSed campaign's top priorities. So I'll give an overview of what is included for each of our top priorities. So the first was $25 billion in rental assistance that we think would help serve hundreds of thousands of households, $65 billion to help preserve public housing, and $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, which we think would build or preserve 150,000 homes for people with the lowest incomes. Before I get into it, I have to say, this is a really amazing outcome. We were so excited to see these numbers, and the reason why they are so high is because of all of the advocacy that you've done over the last, weeks and months. And it's good to take this moment, I think, to pat ourselves on the back for all of the great advocacy that we've all done together. So why do I say that? Well, one of the $150 billion, these three priorities are the three biggest line items in the entire housing portion. And together they amount to 70% of the total allocation, which means that all of us together had a real impact on helping encourage the committees to focus resources on people with the lowest income. So that's worth pointing out, I think. In terms of rental assistance, the $25 billion is the number overall. Of that amount, $22.1 billion is for housing choice vouchers. That's split between $7.1 billion for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness and survivors of domestic abuse and trafficking. The rest of the funds are targeted to extremely low-income households. So we're really glad to see that there's targeting involved with those vouchers. Beyond that, there's also $1 billion for project-based rental assistance and some money set aside for tenant protection vouchers, mobility services, and landlord outreach. This is the single largest expansion of rental assistance since the program was created 50 years ago. And if enacted, is a real major victory, I think, for advocates across the country. For public housing, I mentioned before, $65 billion for public housing. This money is going to be used to remediate immediate health hazards that are in public housing, increase energy efficiency, preserve the nation's public housing stock, and make it more resilient for climate change and natural disasters. It is very close to the $70 billion that is estimated to be needed to address the full capital backlog need in public housing. So it's not 100% of what we wanted, but it's very, very close. And again, I think this is because of some amazing public housing advocates, but also really clear and strong support from Senator Schumer, Chair Waters, and many others. Of the total amount that's provided, just 10% is set aside for the Public Housing Capital Fund that would use a formula to allocate those resources. This is the rest of the money would be essentially given to the HUD secretary to use their discretion in allocating resources. This matches what has been in previous versions of the bill and is something that we support because we want to make sure that money is getting to where it's needed most. And we know that the formula itself wouldn't allow that. And lastly, I'll talk about the $15 billion that's included for the Housing Trust Fund. Clearly this is a huge expansion of the Housing Trust Fund compared to where current funding levels are, which is less than $1 billion. Really amazing to see this happening here. Just an important thing to note is that these resources are provided through a set aside within the home program. So it's for Housing Trust Fund grantees, it's for Housing Trust Fund activities, but they shoehorned it into the home program, and largely because they wanted to make sure some of the regs that were in place were matching the home investments. So nothing to worry about there. We're very pleased with this, even though it's sort of a wonky way of doing it. And I'll ask my colleagues to share in the chat box what we estimate each state or territory will get of the $15 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, so you can see what money might be coming your way. In terms of other provisions in the bill outside of our priorities, I'll just nod to a couple of them. There is $10 billion for down payment assistance, which we know was Chair Waters' other top priority for this bill going forward. There's $10 billion for the home program, $5 billion to address lead hazards, $3 billion in CDBG funds, rural housing money to help address zoning barriers. It's essentially all of the elements that were in the previous version of the bill, but pared down to meet this new $150 billion cap, which again is about half as much as what was proposed originally. So what is next? Whew. Well, this is where things get drawn out and complicated. Leadership wants to be able to vote on this package as quickly as possible. They've said that their goal is to vote on it possibly Wednesday. Originally, they wanted it to be on Tuesday, but there were some delays in finalizing the bill text. Maybe Wednesday is the first possible day that we could see a vote in the House on this bill. But I don't think we're there yet, and I'll get into that in a second. So what we know is that the committees were working over the weekend to finalize some technical changes to the bill. As long as they're making changes, that means they have to republish the final bill text. When that comes out, we're going to read it very closely to make sure that nothing that impacts housing has been made. But we also know that they're still negotiating over key provisions in the bill, which is holding up this process. Largely, those are not on the housing provisions, but until everything gets done, nothing gets done. The progressives are still holding the line to say that they're not going to vote for the bipartisan infrastructure bill until they have a guarantee from Sinema and Manchin that they'll agree to this Build Back Better Act. They want a firm commitment in place before they vote on the bipartisan bill, but in a press conference that just was held at 2 o'clock today, so only a few minutes ago, Manchin sort of rained on that parade and signaled that he wants to take his time, review the legislation much more closely, that he has concerns and he's going to still negotiate, but that he's not anywhere close to reaching an agreement. So that means we have a lot more, possibly more time ahead of us while they continue to negotiate with Manchin and Sinema to try to reach a deal. When they do reach a deal, it's going to be it'll take a while for them actually to execute it and to pass it into law. Once an agreement is reached, the House will vote on the Build Back Better Act, and then it will have to go to the Senate, where they have to go through a complicated process that includes what's called a vote-a-rama, where essentially Republicans will be able to offer as many harmful amendments as they can before they can get it through. And if any changes are made in the Senate through that vote-a-rama process, it'll have to go back to the House for another vote. But considering Manchin's news that he's not ready to sign off on the bill yet, that seems a little far away. So we'll have to cross that bridge when we get to it. In the meantime, Manchin was putting pressure on the House to just vote on the bipartisan bill and to sign it into law. I think there's a big risk there, and I know progressives are very aware of it. They are very concerned that once they vote on the bipartisan bill, they'll no longer be able to use it as leverage to, push Manchin and Sinema to the table to vote for the Build Back Better Act. So we're in sort of just a stalemate, waiting until Manchin and Sinema can finally agree to this text so that it can move forward. So what can we do now to make sure that this bill passes? I think it's really important for you to continue to be engaging your members of Congress and urging them to pass the Build Back Better Act as quickly as possible, and making sure that we keep the investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. We don't want to see further changes to those provisions. We want them to keep it as is. And beyond that, I think we have to do a little bit of waiting for folks in West Virginia and Arizona. I'm sure they're going to be doing more work to try to encourage their senators to get on board. But I think a lot of our work right now is encouraging them to keep the bill as is and to pass it as quickly as possible. So with that, I'll turn it back to Paul.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Sarah. And this really is historic. If we can get this passed, and we need everybody involved to contact your members of Congress to make sure that it does. Sarah, before you get off, though, I do want to ask just a couple of questions. What would you say to someone, Renee, who's expressed concerns about ensuring that there's sufficient federal oversight to ensure that the money gets to those most in need? She mentions New York City needing such oversight.
Maybe she is referring to public housing dollars, because most of the funds, if you think about the rental assistance money, the Housing Trust Fund money, the home dollars, the CDBG dollars, those are allocated using existing formulas. So there's not a ton of work that needs to be done at this point to make sure communities are getting their fair share of the resources. It's sort of already baked into the bill. But there are a lot of places where the HUD secretary will have discretion, and public housing is one of them. I think that's a place where as soon as the bill passes, we and other organizations and advocates will be engaging with HUD to make sure that they are allocating those resources fairly. But for now, the bill text is written sort of in the strongest way that it can, while still passing, following the rules of budget reconciliation that limit really what they're able to do.
Great. There's another question here about if there are any funding set asides for veteran housing projects, or will that need to be addressed directly through the VA funding sources?
There is no specific set aside for veterans in the bill, although I mentioned before that there are resources set aside for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness, which could include veterans.
Okay, very good. There are several other questions. I know that Kim Johnson on our team is responding to some of them, but if you also could take a look, I do want to move on to our next presenter because I know she's got a hard stop at the top of the hour. So thank you very much, Sarah, for that update. As always, incredibly informative. All right, we will move on now to our good friend and colleague, Megan Sandell from Children's Health Watch, to talk a little bit about how housing, affordable housing investments in the Build Back Better Act strengthen healthcare provisions. So Megan, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here. Thanks,
Great.
Paul, and thanks, Sarah, and everyone. I just want to first thank all of you today on this call for your tireless advocacy to secure these historic investments in the Build Back Better Act released last week. While there is more work to do to get this bill across the finish line, your efforts have made a tremendous difference in ensuring housing remains a key feature as part of this package. At Children's Health Watch, which is a research policy network based at Boston Medical Center, we're committed to advancing racial equity and improving the health of young children and families through better public policy. That's why we're honored to be partnering with the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign to advocate for robust housing investments and Build Back Better. As a pediatrician, I see how transformative an affordable home can be for my young patients and their families. And our research at Children's Health Watch repeatedly has shown that housing is an important foundation for health and well-being. It's our work and the work of others that consistently shows that housing quality, stability, affordability, and the neighborhood where housing is located are all linked to important health outcomes across the lifespan, from prenatal period through to old age. And we know that living in unaffordable housing hinders economic mobility and the means that families and individuals have towards more likely experiencing other hardships like food insecurity, which is independently associated with numerous health outcomes. So quite simply, housing is the preventative health care we need for all people to be healthy. And so as we think about strengthening the healthcare provisions, it's really a synergistic effect that housing and healthcare have together because housing acts as that prevention. So the evidence is clear. Given the need and how powerful housing can be for people's health, we need these bold housing solutions to help families stay healthy, to promote financial stability and advance equity. And so I'm really excited about the synergy here between the $150 billion funding for housing and the Build Back Better Act that also includes other evidence-based solutions for advancing health and health equity, such as ensuring the child tax credit is permanently available to families with the lowest income, making early education and childcare affordable, and the additional resources for nutrition assistance and expanding health coverage. These are critical programs when all linked together to create a foundation for health and well-being for generations to come. And so while we know we have a lot more work to do, Build Back Better is a step in the right direction towards securing a healthy future for our children and our country. Just thank you for everything that you do. And I'm really excited to potentially answer some more questions if there's time.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you for all you do to get this message out. Any advice you have for us in terms of, advocates who are, and many people on this call are housing advocates, to get that message so that it's heard by these decision makers?
Yeah, I think that I get asked a lot, Paul, this kind of almost this or question, like which is better? healthcare coverage or investing in housing. And I really think we need to push back on that. It's not an or, it has to be an and, because we know that if you are unstably housed, whether you're homeless or whether you're moving frequently from place to place, or you're just behind on rent and you're now making these toxic choices between rent and food or heat or childcare or all these things, it really is that synergy between having kind of healthcare as a human right and housing as a human right that we know we need to do in order to make people healthier. So I really encourage us as advocates not to get siloed into the ors, but really to show up for each other so that we're always pushing the and holding the line, because I think that's where we're going to be able to see the biggest effect. And so to me, having a stable, decent home is prevention. And that is where we need to be able to focus as much as anything else.
Fantastic. And it does occur to me that, our experience with the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which Megan was instrumental in founding and has been actively involved, pushes advocates who are involved in affordable housing to look beyond housing advocates, to really engage your healthcare partners, throughout the country, to have them reach out and make the case that Megan is making now to their members of Congress, because there are members of Congress who are really very, very dedicated to healthcare, and that's their priority. And maybe they haven't thought about the connections with housing. And I think what we've learned is that when healthcare groups, that they've been used to interacting with and hearing from in the healthcare sector, start talking about, yes, but we also need affordable housing for our children, for the people we care for every day in our clinics. It's absolutely essential. So that's also something that I know through Opportunity Starts at Home that we're trying to do, is get them speaking on our behalf.
Yeah, I think that I just was checking out some of the chat. So for anyone that wants to look for some of the research and policy briefs, our website, Children's Health Watch, all one word, .org, children'shealthwatch.org. We have a bunch of different reports. One that I'll point you to is called Stable Homes for Healthy Families, where we estimate that over 10 years, $111 billion of costs can be averted if every family in America had a stable home. And so as we start to think about it, what we sometimes get put into is, can we afford to do this? And I think we need to push back and say, can we afford to not do this? Because we are incurring unaffordable costs right now in terms of special education, healthcare costs, lack of productivity for people in the workforce because of their unstable housing. And so by making these investments proactively, I think that's important. And I think particularly as we think about things like homelessness and people being unsheltered, we have learned through things like the veterans investments that when you have affordable housing paired with services, you can start to end veteran chronic homelessness and other things. So we have the recipe, we know how to do it. It's now whether we have the political will to implement it.
Great, Megan. And Elena Calabro from NLIHC just put in the Children's Health Watch site and the Stable Homes Make Healthy Families site that you just referred to. The links are now in the chat box, so please take a look at that. And I would also urge you, we have a number of one-pagers and other resources that you might want to take a look at on the Opportunity Starts at Home website about that you can use about the connections between affordable housing and healthcare. All right, I don't think I see any other questions at this time, but Megan, thank you for all you do all the time and for being on this call today.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone on the call. Great work. Thank you.
Take care, Megan. Bye-bye. Okay, we will move on in our agenda now to Shaki Robbins-Kubas, Housing Policy Analyst at the New York Housing Conference, to tell us a little bit about the work that they've done in advocacy around this Build Back Better Act and more. So Shaki, are you with us?
Yes, hi, thank you. Again, my name is Shakti. I'm with the New York Housing Conference. We're a nonprofit affordable housing policy and advocacy organization, and we work on city, state, and federal policy. And first, I just want to thank everyone in NLIHC for leading this amazing and super effective campaign. So when it came to strategy for the House campaign, our partners played a really huge role. We work in coalition with a wide range of organizations. It includes tenant advocates, service providers, affordable housing developers, and other professionals. So we host an advocacy call every other week. We usually get about 80 organizations engaged, and that's just an opportunity to share policy updates, opportunities to engage in advocacy and talk about any events or issues going on. And we have a smaller group of about 40 that we work more closely with on the House campaign priorities. And our partners have been really, really active. The key for us is just to make engagement as easy as possible for them. Like I said, they're mostly practitioners and service providers, so they're not always as deep in the weeds on the federal policy side. We invite them to meetings with the New York delegation to talk about their experiences on the ground. We draft emails for outreach. We of course shared the NLIHC advocacy tool. We draft tweets. We help them place op-eds. And Senator Schumer's office eventually got really, really annoyed with all the outreach from our partners. So we're happy to see that happen. When it comes to member outreach, of course, like in New York, we're really fortunate that the delegation is really supportive of the House priorities. We're always in touch with Senator Schumer's office, Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, who's of course the chair of the Democratic caucus, and the members on House Financial Services. Since they don't need that much convincing, we really focus on keeping housing top of mind for them. Every time we produce something, it's just another touch point for us to reach out to the delegation. We just do a round of outreach to every office. We share what we put out and offer to brief them on it. We did 2 big sign-on letters. The first was in the beginning of the campaign to congressional leadership, and the second was in the past couple of weeks after we got the urgent call from NLIHC. Our partners, came in strong. We managed to get, I think, over 150 sign-ons, and that's really because they shared it with their networks and really answered the call. And we also produce some policy analysis looking at the New York impact, first on the Ending Homelessness Act, the initial $3.5 trillion package, and on private activity bonds. For New York, LIHTC is really important. So we've been complementing our HoUSed advocacy with support for the LIHTC fixes to make sure that HUD funds can be used as effectively as possible. When it comes to communication, we produce some tweets every week. And again, we send them out to our partners as well and ask them to share them. We did some tweets in support of the press conference that Representative Waters held, just supporting them from New York. We organized 2 press conferences with Representative Richie Torres, who's of course been a huge champion for HoUSed. The first was in support of the Ending Homelessness Act, and the second was about a week ago, just to speak to the urgency of including robust housing funding. And we've also published some op-eds ourselves in our local papers for 2 of them. One we did with Representative Jeffries, and we also did one with Representative Torres. So that was really exciting. And again, every time we publish an op-ed, that's just another opportunity to cycle through the offices and let them know, housing is a real priority. Thanks.
Okay, Shakti, thank you so much. Phenomenal work. There's a comment here from Jerry that I've got to share, and that is many thanks for making powerful politicians uncomfortable. And related to that is a question from our own Joey Lindstrom. When Senator Schumer's office got annoyed by all the constituent outreach, did you stop or did you change the tone of your outreach? Did you change your strategy at all?
We didn't stop. You know, that we can't stop. So, you know, I think that's just, it comes with the territory. They still talk to us, so that's good.
Very good. And nor have we stopped. We've heard the same thing. And quite honestly, we've heard from some who have been sharing that they're telling other groups, look, if you really care as much about your issue as the affordable housers do, you should be like them. You should really be making sure that we hear from you very, very frequently. And we know the New York Housing Conference has really done that. So you've done a phenomenal, phenomenal job. I don't see any other questions right now. So I will just thank you, Shakti. I keep pronouncing your name Shakti instead of Shakti. Sorry about that. But thank you for all you've done. Thank you for your partnership. The New York Housing Conference is an NLIHC state partner, and we really, really value your partnership with us. So thank you so much for all you've done.
Thanks so much. You guys are great.
Take care. Okay, we will move on to the next item in our agenda, and that is Elizabeth Glidden, a Deputy Executive Director at the Minnesota Housing Partnership. Elizabeth, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. I'm Elizabeth with the Minnesota Housing Partnership. We are an organization that works in the areas of policy and advocacy, creating research, and also providing technical assistance that's focused on serving rural communities and Native nations. Next slide. And I was asked to give a little bit of some highlights of what we are doing in Minnesota with many of our partners to advocate for utilizing fiscal recovery funds for housing opportunities. Next slide. Yeah, so most of what I'm going to talk about is actually about some advocacy that we are advancing around local communities, but just a couple of things first on the statewide fiscal recovery fund. So as you can see, Minnesota received just a bit under $3 billion that went directly to the state. And we have a very large coalition, the Homes for All Coalition, with 270 plus organizations that leads a lot of the housing advocacy in Minnesota. And they have been leading the advocacy efforts around trying to get the state to dedicate some of these fiscal recovery funds to housing. The governor had about $500 million that he reserved in the 21 session for immediate response, and a small amount of that has been dedicated to housing purposes. The other two buckets were a large bucket for revenue replacement. And so most of our advocacy efforts are gearing up for the 2022 legislative session. And just a little bit of a caveat on this is that a lot of advocacy efforts went into ensuring that some funds from the CARES Act were dedicated for emergency rental assistance. So that was a big win. And then we also had a negotiated eviction off-ramp that I think there's been presentation here about before. So that took a lot of our efforts from the 2021 session. Next slide. So even though the local funding is not as much as what is available at the state level, you can see that there's quite a lot of opportunity here. And Minnesota Housing Partnership has been partnering with other organizations and recently put together a webinar with the Housing Justice Center, which is an organization that provides impact litigation and education and advocacy services in Minnesota, where we featured some conversation with cities and counties that have already dedicated some of their funds to housing. I will say that in Minnesota, many of the communities that have dedicated funds to housing are primarily larger cities, where there are active campaigns and coalitions focused on locals. Next slide. And here, I guess the basic message, just so I move this along, is that local government has been taking it slow. We don't think that's a Minnesota thing. That's happening around the country. And so the bottom line is that there still is opportunity for your advocacy efforts to result in housing wins. Next slide. I wanted to just feature a couple of the examples from Minnesota, and some of these were part of this webinar, and I think that's going to be put into the chat for everyone. So you could see what we thought were some of the exciting opportunities that cities and counties were putting together. Ramsey County is actually a county that houses the capital city of the state of Minnesota, St. Paul. Next slide. And so a lot of their strategies are overlapping with St. Paul. On that Ramsey County slide, you saw that they had a funding strategy to support 30% AMI housing production. And the city of St. Paul has dedicated almost all of their funds for housing, which is almost a quarter of their total fiscal recovery funds, to this particular strategy. They are very excited about it, and we are too, and think it can be a great model for other cities. Next slide. If you can just pass through these next slides quickly. These are some smaller communities in Minnesota, or maybe medium size is more appropriate. And I think Mankato, and then the next slide is for a county in northwestern Minnesota. This shows how existing projects have now been able to leverage funds from fiscal recovery funds. In Hubbard County, this is where we see some layering, with infrastructure prep being funded to present an opportunity for affordable housing later. Next slide. And move on one beyond this. So Hennepin County is the largest county in Minnesota. It's also home to the city of Minneapolis. What's interesting here is that Hennepin County and Minneapolis actually did not have a lot of overlap in their strategies. They had some different types of things that they were focusing on, with the county focused more on shelter and those types of services than the city did. Minneapolis did have these buckets, but they ended up funding 15 different housing strategies. Some of them were completely new strategies, including the one that's titled Increase BIPOC Home Ownership. This is a strategy that they were interested in previously and had some partners, external partners to the city, but had not been able to secure funds. And this allowed them to accelerate this proposal where they had some existing partners. And I think maybe just page through, I want to make sure that I'm saving enough time in case there's questions. I featured a couple of other cities. This is Duluth. It is, again, one of our first-class cities in the state of Minnesota. And Duluth is an example, I think, of a city where they're exercising quite a lot of caution and trying to ensure that their projects will align with the guidance from the interim final rule. And for that reason, they are not wanting to go beyond the census tracts, qualified census tracts strategy. So I'll just close with a couple of highlights that that we learned from this webinar. One is, again, just emphasizing that advocacy remains very opportune, that many cities have not made their decisions, or if they have, they've made them at the big bucket, the high vision level, and they still are looking into implementation. Second is that prior momentum on housing has been instrumental. Almost all these examples were cities where there were some either external pressure or existing projects that resulted in seeing those projects accelerated, or those strategies accelerated with the opportunity of this funding. Implementation is a big issue that was raised in our webinar. And if you're able to listen to that, I think that was very interesting hearing some of the concerns around implementation and timeline. And finally, we do know that we are still dealing with an interim final rule. We still do not have the final rule. And there are significant questions outstanding. One of those that was raised up where many cities and counties are having attorneys raise concerns about loans for housing and how those loan products might align with the timelines within the Fiscal Recovery Fund's interim final rule. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth, so much. A couple of questions have come in. I was really fascinated to see St. Paul's focus on 30% of AMI. And we have a question here. Is there some place where people can go to get more details on that effort on the 30% of AMI affordable housing initiative?
Yes, so I think that NLIHC is putting in the chat the link to the webinar that we just did and also the slideshow. There is a little bit more detail because we had a housing director from St. Paul present about St. Paul's strategy. I will say though too, they are at the early end of scoping out their strategies with this 30% AMI focus. And so they are still working through issues such as how to construct the financing to be compliant. And the other thing I think I had mentioned is this is a partnership effort with Ramsey County, the county that St. Paul sits within. So they're also working through issues of how to combine those funds together into one pot to move forward this initiative.
Outstanding. Lori Massey asked the question, how did Minneapolis use the fiscal recovery funds to house people experiencing homelessness? I'm wondering specifically about the ongoing need for dollars for long-term housing strategies for people, particularly in an urban area where housing costs are relatively high.
Thanks. And I am trying to look back to refresh myself on my slides. Minneapolis did have funds that were dedicated to supporting those ongoing strategies. I will say though that the county that Minneapolis sits within, Hennepin County, they dedicated a larger amount for that particular strategy. And that was the one strategy where Minneapolis and its county, Hennepin, were partnering and ensuring those funds kind of overlap. Traditionally, Minneapolis has focused a lot of its funding on capital. And so it has been a change for the city to expand and fund more service types items, which I think that they are starting to do.
Outstanding. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, not only for this presentation, which we really appreciate, but also for all your great work. Great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we will move on to the next portion of our agenda, and that is to invite members of our ERACE team here at NLIHC, and I think we will get it started with Emma Foley, who's a research analyst on emergency rental assistance for NLIHC. Emma?
Great, thank you, Paul. So NLIHC continues to track ERA spending. Next slide. Using the most current data available, and as of this morning, we are tracking approximately 12.3 billion that has been spent or obligated of ERA1 funding. This does include the most recent Treasury data for September, which was released last Monday. On our ERA dashboard, you can also find a link to more detailed tracking for each state program and programs with data dashboards. Next slide. New spending data from Treasury for the month of September was released last Monday, right before this call. And so I just wanted to return to some of the high level findings from that most recent release. This data is current as of the end of September, so it's slightly less than the data I just cited because it's now a bit outdated. But by the end of September, grantees spent 2.6 billion of ERA1 funding, which represents 40% of the $25 billion ERA1 allocation. Grantees also spent 354 million of ERA2 in September, bringing the total amount of ERA funding spent to 10.3 billion.
State grantees spent 38% of their funding by September 30th, but there continues to be uneven spending across states. New Jersey, DC, New York, and Illinois, for example, spent over 3/4 of their allocations, while 18 other states spent less than 15% of their allocation by the end of September. In general, local grantees continue to spend more quickly than states, and they spent 60% of their total ERA1 allocation by the end of September. Next slide. And September's spending also marked an important milestone because this data will be used to begin the process of recapture and reallocation. Just as a reminder about the reallocation process, all grantees that have obligated less than 65% of their funds are required to submit a performance improvement plan due November 15th. Additionally, grantees who did not obligate at least 65% of their ERA1 funding and who spent less than 30% of their funding will be determined to have excess funds. The amount of funds recaptured will be based on the difference between the grantee's actual amount spent and the 30% benchmark set by Treasury. If you're curious about whether your state or locality is at risk of having funds recaptured, I've linked in this slide a spreadsheet that lists state and local grantees and their potential excess funds. And we'll also put the link to that in the chat. The spreadsheet predicts excess funding based on 2 different scenarios. The first includes the amount of funding eligible for recapture if grantees do nothing. And the second scenario includes the amount of potential funding eligible for recapture if grantees submit a performance improvement plan. This information can be found in the last 2 columns of that spreadsheet. And overall, based on this data, we see that 32 state grantees and 80 local grantees fall below the 30% spending benchmark as of the end of September. This includes several states with large renter populations, including Arizona, Georgia, Tennessee, and Ohio, which had all spent less than 15% by the end of September. Next slide. And then lastly, I just wanted to provide a few additional resources on reallocation. I've linked here reallocation guidance from the Treasury as well as NLIHC's overview. And that NLIHC resource also will be updated in the coming days with additional information and resources. I've also linked to some new resources released last week by Treasury, which includes their performance improvement plan form and a form for grantees to request additional funds. Next slide. And lastly, we provide more detailed spending data for state programs and programs with dashboards at bit.ly/ERA-spending. And feel free to reach out to us at research@nlihc.org with any questions. And I know I've cited a lot of links in this presentation. They'll all be sent out in the email after this call. And if there's any missing from the chat, I'll be sure to put them there as well.
Great, thank you very much, Emma. I'm now going to turn it over to the lead for our End Rental Arrears to Stop Eviction project, Sarah Gallagher. Are you with us, Sarah? I will just say, Emma, there were a couple of questions that came in from you for you in the Q&A. If you could just take a look at those, I'd appreciate that.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Great. Thanks, Paul. And thanks, Emma, for that great summary and tracking that of emergency rental assistance. So hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Gallagher. I'm the Senior Project Director of HoUSed. And as in addition to tracking the data related to the rollout of emergency rental assistance, part of the work we're doing here at NLIHC is working with our HoUSed cohort members who are really doing a deep dive in specific states and localities to support effective, equitable distribution of emergency rental assistance. And here you'll see we've right now a cohort of 38 members who are really working closely, both within their communities and together to identify best practices, to problem solve in real time, to provide technical assistance to administrators, to provide grassroots advocacy, and also to sometimes provide direct supports to tenants who might need more marketing and outreach to learn about emergency rental assistance and learn how to access it. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about ERASE, and then we're going to hear from 2 of our ERASE cohort members around some of the great work they're doing. Next slide. So our race work really stems within our call to action, and folks have hopefully heard this before, but our goal is to really ensure that the emergency rental assistance programs are visible, they're accessible, and preventive. And by that, we mean that the programs are really conducting the equitable outreach and marketing to ensure that the most marginalized renters and small landlords are able to access emergency rental assistance at the time when they need it most. Ensuring that the programs are accessible means that we're supporting low barrier, streamlined programs that really use all of the Treasury flexibilities to make applications as easy and as timely as possible to avoid eviction and ultimately to avoid housing loss. And by preventive, we mean that they're integrated. They're integrated with our state and local court systems. They're integrated with the broader service and housing community, so that we really are looking at the long-term success of tenants who are able to access the program. Next slide. Thank you. So cohort goals and activities really range within the parameters of ensuring visible, accessible, and preventive programs. The three primary strategies they're using are to influence programs to accelerate the use of funds. Second is to support eviction prevention and diversion measures. And the third is really monitoring progress and encouraging transparency through data collection and through using that data to inform the programs as we move forward. As we go forward in our national calls, you'll be hearing from our RACE cohort members, and we'll be sharing some of those lessons learned with you all, so you can hopefully take this back and replicate some of this innovation within your own communities. So next slide. Today, our spotlight is going to focus on two ERASE programs. First, we're going to hear from Florida Housing Coalition and Cody Glazer, who's the legal director there. And then we're going to hear from United Community Housing Coalition and the collaboration of organizations that are working in Detroit. The nice thing about our two program spotlight models today is that in Florida, they're really working to convene local administrators and to provide assistance to help them utilize best practices to inform the program. In Detroit, you'll hear more about an outreach and engagement strategy that's trying to ensure access to most marginalized renters there. So I'm really excited and pleased to be able to have our two groups here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Cody to talk about what's happening in Florida. Hi, Cody.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. It's delightful to be here today. My name is Cody Glazer. I'm the legal director of the Florida Housing Coalition. You can go to the next slide. One more slide from there. Okay. So the Florida Housing Coalition, we are a statewide nonprofit, but we're also the state's training and TA provider for a number of affordable housing programs. And so why this is important for the work we're doing with the ERASE program is that through our role as the state TA provider, is that we have existing relationships with the 119 local governments in Florida that receive state housing dollars, to the point where last year from July to February 2021, we were the state's TA provider for Florida's CRF program for emergency housing assistance. And this was the program that deployed $120 million through our state housing finance agency to 119 local government housing offices. And we were the state's training and technical assistance provider for that. And so we used that personal experience as the state's TA provider with our ERASE grant project, which is to really study how those takeaways from the first year of COVID can be extended into this Treasury ERASE ERAP program. So next slide. And so we've actually been working with NLIHC starting in last October through a project to track and influence programs here in Florida. And we did want to use our experience as a state's TA provider to really analyze how it was going. And so because we were the state's TA provider, we could get data relatively quickly throughout the entire state. So if you go to the next slide, our biggest work that we did with NLIHC in the past year was our research manager, Blaise Denton, created a series of maps that actually look at every household that was assisted in the state through the CRF program. These are over 30,000 households. The program spent over $133 million. And so we were able to map by census tract all of those households that were served, and then layer on the Urban Institute's Rental Assistance Priority Index. And so after I finish speaking, I'll put a link to this map in the chat. Essentially, you can go city by city, county by county, see where funds were spent and whether or not need was correlated with the funding. And generally what we found that statewide, census tracts with higher need did get higher funding, but it does differ pretty broadly, I would say, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. We still have a lot of work to do to really dive into why when we look at city by city. But if you go to the next slide as well, we have a series of 4 maps that look at for the rental assistance priority index, and then also look at things like COVID needs and other housing needs, as well as equity. And so I can provide all those maps in the chat. We did a lot of mapping and a lot of takeaways in the report we submitted to NLIHC on how need is matching with funding in the state, starting with the CRF program last year. Next slide. And so for the ERASE project, we really wanted to extend on the work we've already done in the past year with NLIHC and as a TA provider. And so our goal is to really facilitate existing partnerships and also to expedite funds for those 32 local governments in Florida that receives Treasury funds. And so I think we are well situated to do this because we had those existing relationships. And so we are doing 3 different things through the ERASE grant. The first thing we've done so far is we've hosted 2 monthly workshops so far with the 32 local governments in Florida that receive Treasury funds. And between the first 2 workshops that we've had, we have our 3rd this Thursday, 25 of those 32 ERAP administrators have been present. And so we've had a good time, sharing the reallocation guidance, having guest speakers on from the high-performing local governments to share what's going well, what's not going well. And actually in October, we had a really exciting workshop where we had 3 legal services attorneys from around the state explain how ERAP dollars can be used to help their work in their eviction prevention efforts. So we've been really using these workshops to facilitate the ERAP administrators among themselves to talk it out, figure out what's working best, and to share those ideas. The second thing we've been doing through the ERASE program is we're offering free TA to local governments to facilitate course correction between ERAP 1 and ERAP 2, as well as just overall system change. Our goal was to provide free TA to at least 10 local governments throughout the course of a year. 3 months in, we've already worked with 5 local governments from just one-off question and answer sessions to full audits of their programs. And even last week, we were asked by a local government here to actually write their policies for how they can provide funds to their local legal services organization. So we're really getting a lot of good work out of the free TA we're providing. And then finally, our research managers collecting and analyzing real-time data from our partners to better shape our TA generally. Next slide. And so basically what we're doing is, so those 32 local governments in Florida, to date, we've interviewed about 16 of them individually. And the way that we're monitoring and influencing these programs is we're really taking sort of an audit approach. And these questions are gathered from just our own experience. This is not a full list of them, of course, and also from the document and guidance that NLIHC has provided. But basically, we're just getting to the conversation by just asking them, are you doing these certain best practices? And if not, why? So we'll just go into the conversation, very cordial, ask things like, do you require past due rent? Just really making sure they're using all of their eligible expenses, doing all the eligible activities, asking if they're doing direct attendant assistance, and if not, why? Do they allow self-attestation? And basically just having a conversation about, are they adopting these best practices? And if not, why? And then how can we help them do that? Because we find that a lot of the time, these housing administrators, ERAP is just one of maybe 5 programs they're doing at a given time. And so all the time, they really just want to see the documents to implement themselves without having to come up with them on their own. So that's how I see that we have the most value as TA providers, is to give the work to them for free, and so they can implement best practices without them having to do too much work on the front end. And next slide. And so here's our takeaways so far with the ERASE program, and this is sort of extended over the past year. The first thing we really found that is very helpful is to act with grace when working with these local programs. I think, as affordable housing people, I just personally believe we have a long-term interest in making sure that good people are in these local housing positions long-term. And so we were just recognizing, this is one of 5 programs they're working on, meet them where they are, provide whatever they can to get these best practices implemented, giving them all the documents they need so they don't do that much themselves. The second thing we've seen is that robust TA really is essential. What we found a lot of the time is that just because Treasury changes the program doesn't mean it necessarily gets down to the local level that quickly. And so that's always very needed. Staff turnover has been a really persistent issue in Florida. And so we've had to do some consistent training, like training temps, training new employees who are just on first day on the job, they start, certifying applicants can be pretty tough, pretty onerous. And so that's always been a persistent issue. The one interesting thing we found in Florida, I'm not sure how prevalent this is nationwide, is that we're seeing a lot of folks in Florida do allow the 3 months of future rent for folks. But it's sort of like a both sides thing, because we're seeing that, you know, when an applicant is approved for assistance, the local government's automatically giving them approval for future 3 months of rent, which is good. We want that to happen for housing stability purposes. But in some cases, that's actually preventing new applicants from coming into the program because they've already obligated 3 months future rent for everyone that comes in the door. And so folks who may be more in need are not necessarily getting in the door as when they need to, if they're at risk of eviction more than others. And so, you know, we have a lot of takeaways that we've provided in the report to NLIHC. We're really looking forward to our continued work with NLIHC, and all their guidance has been really helpful, you know, to our work locally. And so, you know, that's the update I have today. Thanks for having me, and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thanks, Cody. That was fabulous. There was one question that came up in the chat around is Florida Housing Coalition engaging people with lived experience into amplifying the impact of your efforts and pointing towards areas for improvement. So are you guys engaging people with lived experience in your work, and if so, how?
A little bit. So because we are statewide, you know, I find the best way to do that is to really engage the folks that are better than us at that, like those local housing nonprofits that really do have a foot in the door and do already speak to them from down the day to day. So we see our role more of connecting the local governments to those organizations that are connected locally, because we aren't necessarily that group. So we recognize that there are better organizations locally that can do that. And so we just kind of want to facilitate those partnerships rather than us do it ourselves. And so we just want to like uplift the folks that are already doing it rather than us trying to be that, you know, statewide entity that's trying to tell them what to do. So.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for that so much.
So let me jump in just to say we'll move on to the next session, which is our partners in Detroit. But I will just mention to them, given the timing with Senator Van Hollen coming on, I may need to jump in, introduce Senator Van Hollen, and then we'll definitely come back and continue. I just wanted to mention that before we go. Go ahead.
Oh, that's great. Nope, that's perfect, Paul. And so, yeah, with that, I'll introduce Tanya Myers-Phillips, who's with United Community Housing Coalition, to lead her team to talk to us about what the work they're doing. So, Tanya, I'll hand it over to you.
You're muted, Tanya.
Yeah. Oh, you're still muted, Tanya. It looks like you're not muted, but we can't hear you. No.
Can you hear me?
We can, Tanessa. Yep. Do you want to?
Okay. Well, let's change to, these are a picture of our cohorts right here. United Community Housing Coalition, Michigan Legal Services, Wisdom Institution, Congress of Communities, and Detroit Action. If Tanya can jump in, she can, but next slide, please. Okay. This is Miss Gwendolyn Wilson part.
So actually, our project, Keeping Detroiters in Their Home, it's a continuation and expansion of our ongoing work of tenants, Detroit residents, nonprofit organizations, legal aid organizations, Detroit officials, and district court. We organize, we train, we support Detroit tenants and homeowners in conducting on-the-ground advocacy, outreach, partnership development, systems change and reform that's needed to shape Detroit's ERA program in the short term, and also to adopt long-term eviction prevention measures like the right to counsel. We have big goals to accelerate the use of emergency rental assistance using neighborhood networks, apply permanent eviction prevention measures by establishing a right to counsel for Detroiters facing eviction, and change the narrative on the data. We're training Detroit residents to tell their own stories and offer a narrative and elevate our use of qualitative data. Next slide. So our team is, as T indicated, United Community Housing, Michigan Legal Services, Congress of Communities, Detroit Action, and the Wisdom Institute. UCHC is providing legal services, ERA, housing placement, home repair and purchase, and tenant organizing. Legal Services, Michigan Legal Services is providing legal services, public policy, advocacy, and Congress of Communities is our community organizing hub. Youth services, family services, immigration and undocumented families assistance, bilingual service. And Detroit Action is our true on the ground organization doing community organizing, public policy, advocacy, social services, and a lot of training. And the Wisdom Institute is concentrating on community outreach and public policy advocacy and community-based research and storytelling. So we are a collaboration. We're 5 organizations. We all are Detroit-based, and our project leads live in the city of Detroit, with 3 out of 5 of our project leads who are Detroit renters. Next slide, please. So our approach is continuing and expanding the work of diverse stakeholders and what we call upping our level, not allies, but accomplices. And you see the list that was mentioned earlier. In addition, the Wisdom Institute is leading a deep dive outreach to women in ministry and spirituality as trusted messengers who help us create gracious space. We are practicing solidarity rather than operating in silos, as has been our past in Detroit. We're going where the people are. We decided we're going where the people are. We're using grassroots sensibilities. We're using relational organizing, and we're developing a word of mouth urban communication system. We are piloting a neighborhood business to business information hub. We have barbershops, men's suit shops, hardware stores, natural hair salons, gyms, food pantries, and these are trusted messengers in the neighborhood. We're intentionally finding common ground with Black, Indigenous people of color at the center. There's a power analysis. We're talking about shared power, negotiating decision-making. We're infusing art and healing from a womanist lens. And we're really activating solidarity, collectivizing, and pushing for decolonization. We also have a emphasis on resource development. It's extemporaneous. We have a grant writing team who pulls together, and they supplement and support grassroots skills, grassroots skill building, and needs. Our next slide, please, and Ted Phillips will take over.
Thank you. Ted Phillips, Executive Director of United Community Housing Coalition. And our organization deals with legal representation, relocation assistance, and some organizing assistance in subsidized developments. During the race period, we've had 868 cases that our attorneys have been able to intervene on. About 90% of those not only include assistance with paying the back rent and 3 months future rent in Michigan, but they also include dealing with repair issues. 20% of the funds are set aside in certain circumstances where there are repairs needed in the court, and until those repairs are done, the funds remain there. In cases where we're not able to provide a legal resolution because the property is in such poor condition, or there are not non-payment cases that ERAP can respond to, then we also provide relocation assistance. We've engaged in extensive outreach as a coalition, but also the UCHC has done as well, to tenants that were facing an imminent eviction from a bailiff. We've worked with the 36th District Court, the court in Detroit that handles all landlord-tenant matters, and the city of Detroit to do outreach to make sure that we particularly target that group. Many in that group are very challenged. All of our hearings are virtual, and many of our tenants are somewhat challenged in that regard. There's a very high default rate, and most of the persons facing eviction are persons who've had a default judgment because they weren't able to show up in court. We've paid out since the beginning of the Erase grant. The Housing Coalition has paid out roughly $9 million. We are one of 2 organizations, however, in Detroit that handles ERAP funds. Ours are dedicated almost strictly to cases that are in court. The other organization handles cases not yet to that point, and they paid out $24 million over the same period. So a substantial amount of money paid out there. T is going to take it from here to talk a little bit about the door knocking and the tenant organizing meetings.
Hello, everyone. I go by T, Tanisha Sanders. She, her, hers is my pronouns. I am Detroit Action Renters and Tenant Organizer. In collaboration of all our organizations that's combined, we have knocked 4,500 homes. In Detroit Action, we get from Ted Phillips, the United Community Housing Coalition, we get a list for the RIT, the people that's in the final stages of the court. And we have knocked a little under 200 doors. And we make sure we do 3 attempts if we have not talked to the tenant themselves. And we also try to leave information for the landlords too, to let them know it's programs out here. With that being said, we have 3 tenants organizing meetings a month. The first Tuesday, we have renters and tenants, and that's based solely on renters and tenants and what their needs are. Then on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, we have a housing committee, which includes renters and tenants, homeowners, land contract, and also room boarders. We're finding out is another tenant. And also we have a National Tenants Association meeting on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, which is including all states across the nation right now, United States. And we're just trying to educate the neighborhood and get them as many resources as we can as possible. Thank you. I would like to pass it on to Rhea unless Paul needs to talk.
Yes, actually, thank you so much, T. That was fantastic. Everything you guys are sharing is just phenomenal. I believe that we may have the senator online with us, so I just want to check that. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. I'm here.
Oh, great, great, fantastic. We will come back to our Detroit group in just a few minutes. If you guys can put yourselves on mute and stop sharing your cameras. Let me go ahead and say a few words of introduction. So Senator Chris Van Hollen represents Maryland in the U.S. Senate, where he's serving on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Earlier this year, Senator Van Hollen introduced bipartisan legislation, the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, with Republican Senator Todd Young, to create 500,000 new housing vouchers paired with mobility services to allow families with young children to move to areas with resources, including good performing schools. He has been a leader in the efforts to ensure that the Build Back Better Act includes a major expansion of rental assistance. And thanks to his leadership and the dedication of other congressional champions, the bill does include $25 billion in rental assistance, including resources for mobility services. When it's enacted, it will be a major victory for low-income households who struggle to pay the rent. Senator Van Hollen, thank you so much for your leadership, and thank you for joining us on today's call.
Well, thank you, Paul, and tell Diane, and I hope she feels better. And I really just want to jump on for a few minutes to thank all of you at the National Low Income Housing Coalition for all the work that you're doing every day to help every American find a safe and secure and affordable place that they can call home, and for your efforts in pushing to ensure that the Build Back Better agenda has robust provisions in support of affordable housing. All of you have helped people weather the storm during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, through a series of measures, including the American Rescue Plan, we were able to provide substantial emergency relief, including relief to help people pay their mortgage and utilities and other housing costs, the rental assistance program, most recently about $22 billion in the American Rescue Plan, and about that much again in the December bill, $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers. So thank all of you for being on the front lines, helping people in need during this pandemic. We also all recognize that we cannot simply go back to where we were pre-pandemic. I mean, that's not good enough. The pandemic has exposed deep inequities in so many areas, from healthcare to the digital divide and housing. And that's why we've got to pass the Build Back Better agenda, because we've got to really tackle those issues. And I am pleased that the most recent framework includes over $150 billion for affordable housing programs. And we were very worried that as the overall amount came down, and I'm sure you were all following that debate as it came down from 3.5 trillion to approximately now, which is the 1.75 trillion, that when that amount dropped, we were afraid that housing might be on the chopping block. But in fact, we still have a very robust investment of over $150 billion, very close to what President Biden had originally proposed as part of the Build Back Better plan. And that includes funds for the trust funds, the Housing Trust Fund, $15 billion, $65 billion to preserve public housing. And very importantly, as Paul just said, and something we've all been fighting for, $25 billion to expand a rental assistance vouchers to hundreds of thousands of Americans. And also something we've been working with and for $300 million to provide wraparound services to support the legislation that Paul just mentioned. And thank you for all your support as a coalition for that. The Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, allowing families with young kids the means to move to areas of greater opportunity. And all the studies and work that's been done shows that in order to be successful, that needs some wraparound services to help with the transition. And I'm really pleased that this latest framework, the Build Back Better framework that's emerged, includes those additional funds. So thank you for all you've done to keep pushing. Thank you for what you're doing on the front lines. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions you may have. But my bottom line message is keep it up, because all of you know, when it comes to legislation, it ain't over till it's over. And until we get this over the finish line, we've got to make sure we are calling members of the House and Senate to say, keep going. We're glad that the $150 billion for housing is in. We're glad that the funding for affordable housing vouchers is in. Let's keep it in and let's get the job done.
Well, fantastic. I know your schedule is very, very tight, and we won't keep you, but you answered one of the questions. Just keep, what else can we do? Basically, just keep at it. Keep calling your members of Congress. Make sure that they hear from all the advocates on this call. Do you have any sense for when you think a vote will actually happen?
Well, I'm hearing from our colleagues in the House that when they get the text of the bill, they're prepared to move forward. Right now we have a framework. It's getting pretty well filled in, but we don't have complete text. They also would like to hear, as would I, from two of our Senate Democratic colleagues, that they support the framework. But the bottom line is that once you have a framework, and even once you have the language, it takes a little bit of time, because we need, and this is a good thing, we need the full analysis from the Congressional Budget Office in order for this bill to even be considered by the Senate. Once the House finishes it, for it to be considered by the Senate, we need that Congressional Budget Office score and report. That's really a condition of the budget reconciliation process. So if the House if we can get that final bill, then we can begin, begin this process. I am very hopeful, Paul, that, by this time next week, it would be great if we could be, working on this in the United States Senate, having the House having completed its work. So let's see. But back to the earlier point you made and I made, everyone should just keep calling, emailing, texting, urging our colleagues to get it done, and making sure that they understand how important it is to keep these housing provisions in the final bill.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Again, I don't want to keep you, but there is one question from one of our colleagues, Meredith Dodson from Results. Are you at all worried, or how worried are you that there's any chance that the housing dollars could be reduced as we go through this process?
Well, the framework is supposed to be the result of that process. It's right. It's supposed to be the result of all the negotiations that have taken place. I'm very pleased with where we are. As I said, I mean, this is the legislative process. Anything can happen anytime, but we've made clear, those of us on, the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, how important and vital these provisions are. It's important that our colleagues in the House are doing the same, and I'm confident that they are. But it can only help if our members are hearing from all of you directly, from their home districts and home states.
Senator Van Hollen, thank you again so much for your leadership on this and on affordable housing generally over the last number of years. And thank you so much for joining us on today's call.
Well, it's great to be with you.
Take care.
Thank you to the coalition.
All right,
bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will now return to our colleagues from Detroit to continue where they left off. Our apologies for that interruption there.
I think Ria was going to talk her piece.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I cannot start the video because the host won't let me, but if you could please start my video, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. I'm not sure what happened there. But my name is Ria Macy. I am the Building Sustainable Communities Manager for Congress of Communities, she, her, hers pronouns. And to kind of circle back to what T was saying after the 4,500 plus doors knocked and the tenant organizing. In addition to all of that, we are also we have conducted a healing justice listening session. And the topic of that was exploring the power within, because while our outreach and our numbers are extremely important, so is building power in our people, and so is giving them a space to heal and be heard, right? We're dealing with human beings on a daily basis, and we need to make sure that we approach them with empathy and respect because they're going through a lot of different things. In addition to the listening session, we have also conducted a policy education meeting, in addition to hosting a week-long Right to Counsel informational presentation with our entire Detroit City Council. And in these meetings, we also had included the voices of community leaders as well as tenants that were able to ask council questions and talk about what a right to counsel would mean for them in their own homes and in their own communities. And then following up with this, we have conducted one phone bank outreach session, as well as 3 external stakeholder meetings. And we continue to do even more work. This is honestly just the tip of the iceberg of the work that we're all doing as a collaborative team. And I know we can only move forward from here. And then as a kind of last point, if you are interested in learning even more about the work that we're doing here in Detroit specifically, please check out the front page free press article that I will also drop in the chat, and that covers more of our eviction prevention work as well as our right to counsel outreach work. Thank you.
Hear me now?
Outstanding. Oh,
Yes. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Thank
Tanya,
you so
okay.
much, team. You see why I love my team in Detroit. Thank you so much, everyone. And just to bring it home, in conclusion, we are all united by our belief that housing is a human right, and we are working together to permanently reduce evictions. We work across these 4 pillars. Each element is necessary to achieve the long-term systemic change we all deserve in housing stability. We need the institutional change, so we're fighting for a right to counsel for Detroiters facing eviction. We need power. We need power to be shared and distributed amongst those who are most impacted. So we are working on tenant organizing, collaboration. This is too big for any one person or any one organization or institution to tackle by themselves. So we work across platforms and have a diverse stakeholder collaboration. And basic needs. While all of this is coming together, we advocate and continue to educate for emergency rental assistance to continue flowing. So we work across each pillar, each of these 4 areas to see change in our city. Slide. And finally, if you want to keep in touch with us at the Keeping Detroiters in Their Home team, we've shared our contact information. Again, we're a strong collaborative. We're proud to work together, and thank you so much for inviting us to share with you this afternoon. And we'll take any questions.
Tanya, Ted, Tanisa, Gwendolyn, Ria, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation and for the fantastic work that you guys are doing. It's so important, and we at NLIHC are really pleased to be able to support you financially with this work and through other resources that hopefully will help you do the work that you're doing. Tremendous job. And I do want to circle back because we're running out of time, but I wanted to make sure that I said to Cody, Cody also just amazing work that you're doing there in Florida. We will invite you guys back to give us updates later on. Can't wait to hear about the results of your efforts. But what you're doing is just so important. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're a minute away from the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and just close out by just urging everyone, please, in these final hours and days, please reach out to your members of Congress. Make sure that they vote for the Build Back Better framework. Let's get this done. This would be historic, and it is much needed, as we all know. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to all of our panelists for being on the call today. Thank you for all of our listeners, and we'll see you next Monday. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.